These are the topics that we shall discuss. So let's start with Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson, also known as Dr. Johnson, was born on September 18, 1709 and died on December 13, 1784. He was a he was an English critic, biographer, essayist, poet, lexicographer, and was regarded as one of the greatest figures of 18th century life and letters. Samuel Johnson contributed largely in English literature. Particularly, uh, he contributed immensely in creating the first dictionary of English language. His works include Rasselas, Thoughts on the Late Transactions Respecting Falklands Island, The Vanity of Human Vices, Irene, an account of the life of Mr. Richard Savage, son of All Rivers. This Richard Savage would be important in studying London. London, the poem that we shall discuss, The Patriot, Debates in the Senate of Magna Liliputia, a complete vindication of the licenses of the stage, and he was the founder of the journal called Rambler. Since this poem's name is London, we shall focus a bit on Samuel Johnson's interaction with the city London. During March 1737, London Johnson lived in London with his former pupil, the actor David Garrick. Later in October 1737, Johnson brought his wife to London. They first lived at Woodstock Street and then moved to 6 Castle Street. Soon Johnson found employment with Edward Cave and wrote for his The Gentleman magazine. Johnson was exposed to imitations of Horace composed by Pope, and he was much influenced by this translation of Alexander Pope. In May 1738, poem London was published anonymously and it went into a second edition that year. He was immensely influenced by Alexander Pope's translations of Horace's uh, satires, and he wrote this poem, London, in imitation of the Roman satirist Juvenal's third satire. This poem is a long one, which constitutes 263 lines. London was published anonymously, as I told you earlier, and in multiple editions during 1738. It quickly received critical praise, notably from Alexander Pope. Johnson had been exposed to the imitations of Horace done by Pope that I have told you earlier. Poems like Windsor Forest and saw how classical model was deftly used by the senior poet to attack the contemporary political corruption. London is Johnson's longest non-dramatic publication and second only to The Vanity of Human Vices. The Vanity of Human Vices, once again, it was another imitation of Juvenal satire, particularly 10th satire. Iron Jack called this poem London as a tragical satire. Why? We shall discuss. Now, I told you earlier that Samuel Johnson's London is an imitation of Juvenal's third satire. So, what was in Juvenal's third satire? Juvenal's third satire is a monologue by a friend of Juvenal called Umbricus, who is leaving Rome for a better life in a country, and who lists all the many ways in which Rome has become an unbearable place to live. Similarly, in Samuel Johnson's London, Johnson's friend Thales travels to Cambria, Wales, to escape from the problems of London. That would be travels, not Ravels. T is missing here. The Epigraph of London. Epigraphs means uh, before starting off a poem, a few lines quoted from another writer, that is particularly epigraph. Now, epigraph of the poem London is from Juvenal. Quis inepte tam patiens urbes tam fereas ut tenetse. It's from Juvenal's first satire. It's 30 to 31. It can be loosely translated into English in this way: who is so patient of foolish wicked city, so iron-willed as to contain himself? So clearly the indication is that you would be a foolish one if you were uh, just facing all the troubles in dwelling in a city and still continue to dwell in that city. Summary of London. Particularly, I should mention this summary is taken from E-Notes. The poem starts in this way: though grief and fondness in my breast rebel, when injured Thales bids the town farewell. So clearly, Thales is leaving the city, and the poet uh, is much grieved about the fact he is grieving that his friend Thales is leaving the city. Yet still my calmer thoughts his choice commend. I praise the hermit, but regret the friend, who now resolves from vice and London far to breath in distant fields a pure air. So this friend is leaving London, which has become a vicious city, to live in a peace, to live in a village, or to live in a place that would be much serene and peaceful, and fixed on Cambria's solitary shore. So this friend is leaving to Cambria. Give to Saint David one true beaten more. So the speaker waits for his friend Thales by the river Thames. He feels sorrowful because his friend has decided to leave London for the country, but he respects and supports Thales' decision. The two men look over London, and for a moment things seem calm. Then Thales frowns and begins to explain why he has chosen to leave the city. Thales feels that London, and all of England for that matter, has declined under the current government and its policies. Let me tell you that this time when this London was written, it was the Whig party which was ruling London. I shall discuss this further. The nation used to be nobler and more just. There were courageous kings such as Edward and Henry, who both won great military victories against England's enemies. There were also kings such as Alfred the Great, who was righteous and inspiring. Such monarchs created a climate that curtailed criminality. Thales believes that during Alfred the Great's reign, a single jail could have held half of England's criminals. So during Alfred the Great's reign, the number of criminals were so less that all the criminals of the entire England could be put into one single jail. He invokes these old rulers to illustrate the heights of greatness from which London and England have fallen. London is now full of criminals, those who are not breaking the law fall prey to those who are. People everywhere are going hungry. They are taken advantage of by the government, which supports pirates who prey on Englishmen. Meanwhile, the nation's leaders are allowed to grow rich by running lotteries and collecting taxes from poor. So the people uh, ruling the government, ruling the people, are just exploiting its subjects, the people, and putting extra taxes and just looting them. These leaders are now driven by the love of money rather than the pursuit of noble aims, leaving Londoners at mercy of such plutocrats. Plutocrats means the aristocrats, the rule of the aristocrats. The working classes are subject to whims of those with less character but more money. Thales feels that the entire city is falling into ruin as falling houses thunder on your head. He attributes these maladies to the misguided culture, but lays most on the most of the blame on the greedy and indifferent government, lamenting how each official constantly tries to raise his treasure higher than before. So this poem is about a corrupt government. Clearly, this was an attack to weak party which was ruling London during this time. Now Thales asks to be given a place where honor, kindness, wisdom are not looked down upon. He wants a better life than the one he has in London. As the end of the poem, he tells, at the end of the poem, he tells the speaker that he has still much to add, but they have run out of time since the boat has arrived. He foresees a time when his friend will also flee London. So Thales expects that this Johnson would also flee from London, would cannot bear the corrupt corrupt government's unruly affairs. Ultimately, he would also leave London when his youth and health and fortune are gone, and then feel enraged enough to pen a satire against the city, presumably in the form of the poem London itself. So Thales is just uh, just making a uh, just making a prediction that this Johnson, who is not leaving the city as of now, would regret someday when he would lose his youth and the best years of his life, and then regret that why he did not choose to leave the city earlier, and in turn would write a satire which could be named as London. That what we are reading now. So clearly, this poem is about London, more about London's uh, vicious atmosphere, and the government is mostly responsible for this. So, particularly, this is about London, and also this is also about a corrupt government. Hmm? Ruling party was a weak party. Hmm? We shall come to this, but first, focus on 18th century London. The poem describes the various problems of London, including an emphasis on crime, corruption, and squalor of the poor. To emphasize his message, these various abstract problems are personified as beings that seek to destroy London. So the problems are personified. So that's why you have the personified characters like malice, rapine, an accident. Hmm? Rapine means uh, it's an rapine would mean an urge to seize others' property. So these physios, so uh, these aspects of human nature and these physious corners of human minds are personified, like malice, rapine, and even accident is also personified. You can find the characters like worth and you see and uh, worship. Okay, so that's why, as I told you earlier, that this Iron Jack called this poem a tragical satire because of its grim picture of how worth is not recognized by the metropolis. So worth is being uh, characterized here, has been personification is done because these aspects of human nature are personified. So the poem is about also about Thales, who is leaving the city. Who Thales represents is unknown actually, but it is most possible that this Thales represents Richard Savage, Johnson's friend, who actually left London to travel to Wales. So, uh, if we believe that Thales is representing Richard Savage, let's us know about Richard Savage a bit. Richard Savage, on whom Johnson wrote one of his earliest, uh, you know, lives, was his friend and companion. Okay, he wrote a poem on Richard Savage. They would visit pubs and coffee houses together late into the night. When Savage, mauled by London's rapacity, was thrown into prison and died there. So this Richard Savage was imprisoned and he died in prison. So after the death of this Richard Savage, Johnson resorted to write a satire. So the main emphasis of the poem comes to light on line 177. Slow rises worth by poverty depressed. So poverty and worth both are personified. So uh, worth is crossed by poverty, and government is responsible for that. So these are the final lines that I'm going to read. Much could I add, but see the boat at hand. The tide retiring calls me from the land. I can add more, I can say more reasons why I'm leaving this London. It is becoming a place where no wise man can live. But my boat is waiting, so I cannot continue anymore. Farewell, then youth and health and fortune spent, thou fliest for refuge to the wilds of Kent, and tired like me with follies and with crimes, in angry numbers once succeeding times. Before bidding farewell to Dr. Johnson, his friend, Thales is saying that when you'd lose your youth and the best times of your life, you'd realize that you have made a mistake, that then you'd realize that you could not any longer bear the follies and criminalities of this city, criminal activities of this city. Then you'd regret that you continued to live in this city. Then shall thy friend nor thou refuse his aid, still for to wise forsake this Cambrian shade. Still then your friend will not leave Cambria. In virtue's cause once more exert his rage, thy satire point and animate thy page. So then you can write a satire regretting your days in this city. So clearly, it was uh, a political context was there in this is there in London, the poem. You see, government is constantly being attacked here, and all the mishaps and the vicious atmosphere of this London and the poverty and economic failure and you can find that the rise of the criminals all are somehow connected to, if we follow poet's argument and Thales' argument, to the government. It was government's failure to maintain cities' peaceful, serene, and loyal atmosphere. So clearly, it was an attack to the contemporary ruling party, and this time Whig was ruling. Let me tell you that this Johnson was a supporter of Tory party. So the British government under the Whig uh, party, which was run by Sir Robert Walpole, opposed to the content expressed in London. So this poem London, which became popular after its publication and went in for second edition, the contemporary government opposed to the content that this poem is betraying. Okay, clearly this government is being blamed the for the mishaps in London. The city of London was seen as a means to attack the weak political party run by the Robert Walpole. So that's what I have said already. In particular, Johnson compares the action of George II and Walpole to those of the Roman emperors during the decline of the Roman Empire. So, as you know, that this poem is an imitation of Juvenal's third satire, hmm, where Juvenal's friend was leaving Rome because it was declining, the moral atmosphere was declining, and you can find this decline of Roman Empire in details in um uh, in it's a very popular book. You can say that the decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. So George II and his Prime Minister Robert Walpole are compared to the dissolute Roman emperors during its time of decline, which is clearly uh, detailed by Edward Gibbons in his Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of Roman Empire. So uh, so that's the reason that uh, because obviously this Dr. Johnson was a Tory supporter. He was blaming weak party, and you can find the lines like "slow rise is worth by poverty depressed." It was a dig at the weak government, that this weak government run by Robert Walpole was incompetent and was somehow unable to decrease poverty. So the main theme in this manner, in which worth is not allowed to rise and is put down constantly by poverty. So Johnson was a Tory supporter, and that's why he was opposing against the rule of King George II. Remember, this was a time of political turmoil, and in this way, he somehow was supporting the Jacobites. Jacobites were the political party, the political, you see, the people with the inclination of supporting James II, and was quite sympathetic to Catholicism. Now Johnson was again a Protestant. He was not sympathetic to Catholics, but he was a Protestant, and but still this poem has this capacity which can be called as a Jacobite agenda. Um, Now, this poem, London, is also showing how the king and his ministers are exploiting the rules of the parliament to put extra taxes on people. You can find the lines like this: propose your schemes, ye senatorian band, whose ways and means support the sinking land, lest ropes be wanting in tempting spring to rig another convoy for the king. So the intention is clear, quite. You can find in this poem a glorification, a kind of nostalgic glorification of the past, of England's past, the rule of Queen Elizabeth, and how she defeated a Spanish army. And this contrast is made to show how this government run by George II, King George II, and Walpole is incompetent and is just defaming England. And this Samuel Johnson, through the words of Thales, is also indicating that this government is allowing Spanish traders to invest in England, and that's why the poverty would increase because the profit would be taken out of England by the Spanish traders. So you can have the lines like this: has heaven reserved in the pity of the poor no pathless waste or undiscovered shore, no secret island in the boundless main, no peaceful desert yet unclaimed by Spain? So Spain is being mentioned, particularly in context of trading and poverty. So if Spanish traders are allowed by the government to invest in England, then it would increase England's poverty.